Elliot Harper had always considered himself a man of reason. A programmer, a skeptic, a lover of logic. So when his friend Chris told him about the new beta for a virtual reality game called Vortex, the multiverse, Elliot was unimpressed. Chris had described it as an immersive simulation where you can experience infinite possibilities, but to Elliot, it sounded like another marketing gimmick designed to reel in people with too much time on their hands. He preferred his own brand of entertainment, complex algorithms and code that made sense, things with defined parameters. Still, he was curious. Not enough to pay for it, but curious enough to try the free beta version. He loaded the game onto his computer with a combination of skepticism and the faintest trace of intrigue. Maybe it was one of those things that seemed ridiculous at first, but after a few hours of immersion, you'd find yourself hooked. As he strapped on the VR headset and clicked through the initial settings, he noticed something odd. The game, instead of offering some kind of introduction or tutorial, immediately immersed him in an empty, sterile white room. Not quite the exciting alternate world he had expected. There was no guidance, no instruction on how to play. Well, this is boring, Elliot muttered to himself. He glanced at the clock on his desk. It was late, past midnight, but he wasn't tired. He adjusted the headset, and the blank white room dissolved into something far more interesting. It wasn't much to look at first. A city skyline sprawled out before him, hazy with the neon glow of advertisements and streetlights. He looked around, slowly, and saw avatars milling about, but they didn't seem to take notice of him. The game world felt lifeless. He couldn't pinpoint what was wrong, but it felt like something was missing, as if the players themselves weren't quite real. Trying to shake off the strange feeling, Elliot clicked on the menu button. His avatar, a generic-looking version of himself, stood frozen in place as a series of options popped up: explore, choices, play, exit. He clicked on choices, figuring it would give him some direction in this aimless world. The moment he selected it, a prompt appeared, asking, "Choose a path. What will you do?" The choices ranged from the mundane to the bizarre: start a new job, steal from the corner store, break into a skyscraper and take over the building. Elliot, half amused and half bewildered, selected start a new job, thinking it would provide some structure. As soon as he confirmed his choice, the world around him rippled. The city skyline shimmered, and when it settled, it wasn't the same place anymore. The buildings were taller, the advertisements brighter, and he stood in front of a sleek glass tower. His avatar, which had previously been wearing jeans and a t-shirt, was now in a sharp suit. The choice to start a new job had taken him to a completely different version of this world. He felt a curious sense of power, and he took a moment to look around. But instead of feeling like he was in a game, something unsettling happened. A notification popped up: reality altered, new world path created. Before Elliot could process the message, he was whisked away to yet another place. This time, he was standing in a stark, minimalist office, with a desk in front of him and a computer screen flashing in the corner of his vision. He reached for the mouse, almost instinctively, and clicked on the screen. It was a message. An email, one that addressed him directly: "Elliot, you've made a change. We're aware of what you've done. You can't undo it. But you can choose to make a different decision. This is your first warning. Choose wisely." He blinked. The email, from someone he didn't recognize, was too cryptic, too chilling. He tried to respond, but the interface glitched. The words on the screen distorted, stretching and distorting like an old VHS tape before the entire screen flickered out. Suddenly, he was back in the white room. The game menu reappeared. Elliot took off the headset, rubbing his eyes, trying to make sense of what just happened. His hands were shaking slightly, and a strange feeling of déjà vu washed over him. He glanced around his apartment. Everything was normal. His coffee mug sat on the table, his laptop humming softly in the corner. No sign of the digital world he had just experienced, but something felt off. The air was thicker, more oppressive, like he had stepped into a world that wasn't quite his own. He looked at the clock. Only 5 minutes had passed since he'd first entered the game. Shaking his head, he decided it was all a glitch. Maybe the beta hadn't been thoroughly tested. It was a new game, after all. It was possible it was bugged. He stood up, stretching his legs, and walked into the kitchen. But when he stepped outside, everything changed. The world outside his apartment was different. The same street, the same buildings, but something was wrong. The coffee shop he always frequented was now a trendy art gallery, its windows adorned with abstract paintings. The people walking by didn't look like they belonged here. They wore clothes that didn't match his memory of this place. He heard snippets of conversation that made no sense, as though he was in a different dimension entirely. And worse, people were looking at him, strangers, people he didn't recognize, nodding at him as if they knew him. Elliot's heart began to race. Was this still his world? He stepped back inside, slamming the door shut behind him. His apartment looked exactly the same, but the world outside had changed, just like the city in the game. His first instinct was to laugh it off, but the nagging feeling that something was deeply wrong wouldn't go away. He sat back at his desk, trying to process everything. He put the headset back on, hoping to return to the strange, unsettling world of Vortex and figure out if the game was responsible for this. The moment he logged back in, it was different again. He stood in a completely new reality, but this time, there was no city. Instead, he found himself in a dilapidated, darkened street where the remnants of a once great civilization were crumbling before him. Graffiti covered every wall. The air smelled thick and sour, like decay. The only sound was the distant hum of machinery. A far cry from the city's neon lights. This reality felt dangerous. The screen flashed again, this time with a new notification. New reality created, path diverged. Decisions matter. Elliot's head was spinning. This couldn't be real. Could it? Elliot's fingers hovered over the controls, his mind racing. The street around him felt like something out of a dystopian nightmare, a world that didn't feel like a game at all. The edges of reality seemed to blur with every passing second, and each new world felt increasingly alien, as though he wasn't just experiencing them, but was becoming part of them. He glanced around, expecting to see other players, but there was no one in sight. No avatars, no NPCs. Just the sound of distant machinery grinding, echoing through the empty streets. He couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of isolation. The virtual world had somehow become too real, and he felt its weight on his chest. He pressed a few buttons to exit the scene, but nothing happened. The game's interface was unresponsive. Panic started to claw at him. What was going on? A flicker of movement caught his eye. He turned toward it, his breath catching in his throat as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a person, or at least something resembling one. Dressed in tattered clothes, their face was hidden under a hood, but the way they moved made Elliot instinctively step back. "Hey," Elliot called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the silence. "Are you part of the game?" The figure stopped, then slowly turned to face him. Elliot couldn't make out their features, but there was something chilling about the way they moved, like they didn't quite belong. They tilted their head, and then their lips parted, speaking in a low, rasping voice. "You shouldn't have chosen that path." Elliot's heart thudded in his chest. "What? I didn't choose anything wrong. I was just playing." The figure took a step closer, and for a split second, the world around them seemed to ripple, as though the fabric of the reality was shifting. He could feel it, a strange pressure, a heaviness in the air, like the world was being held together by fragile threads. "Every choice you make has consequences," the figure said. "And you've made a big one." The figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as suddenly as they had appeared. Elliot stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. What did that mean? What consequences? Was this game really creating these worlds, or was something else at play? Before he could process it further, the street began to flicker again. The buildings, the streetlights, the crumbling remnants of civilization, all of it warped and distorted. A new reality was beginning to form, but this time, Elliot wasn't sure he wanted to be there. He felt a growing sense of urgency, a need to leave before things got even worse. He fumbled with the headset, trying to exit the game, but there was no option. Nothing was working, the world around him continued to flicker, and then, suddenly, everything went dark. When the light returned, he found himself standing in a completely different place. He was no longer in a ruined city, but in a vibrant, bustling metropolis. Tall glass skyscrapers surrounded him, and the streets were filled with people going about their daily lives. It looked like New York City, but everything was better. Cleaner, brighter. More organized. The air smelled fresher, and the people were happier. They didn't look like avatars, they looked real. He took a step forward, and something strange happened. A young woman approached him, smiling as she passed. She wasn't someone he recognized, but as she walked by, she gave him a friendly wave. "Elliot. How's your day been?" He froze, unsure how she knew his name. How could she possibly recognize him? He stammered. "Sorry, do I know you?" The woman stopped, blinking in surprise. "You really don't remember me?" "It's Amy. We met at that conference last year. You've been so busy with your work lately, I haven't seen you around." His mind raced, trying to piece together a memory, but he couldn't place her. There was no conference. No Amy in his life. This was wrong. This wasn't his world, but somehow, it felt real. Too real. Before he could respond, Amy waved and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Elliot stood there, unsure whether to follow or to retreat. Something was off about this place. It didn't feel like his world, but it was convincing. Too convincing. His hand instinctively went to his phone, checking the time, but the device in his pocket wasn't his. The screen, when he pulled it out, showed a completely different interface, with apps he didn't recognize and notifications he hadn't set. He blinked at it, confusion spreading through him. What the hell is going on? And then, just like that, it happened again. The world around him flickered, and the people on the street seemed to blur and vanish. The glass skyscrapers began to distort, and the sky turned a shade of purple that wasn't natural. The sounds of the city became muffled, like he was hearing them from underwater. He felt a sudden pull, a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the world was slipping through his fingers, like sand in an hourglass. The world vanished, replaced by a dark void. "Welcome back," a voice said. It was the same voice as before, the voice from the figure in the dystopian street. Elliot's heart raced as the void began to shift, revealing a shadowy figure standing before him. This time, there was no hiding, no distorted figure. It was a tall man, wearing a sleek suit, his face hidden in shadow. "I told you," the man said, his voice deep and unsettling. "Every choice creates a new world. You can't stop now. You've already made too many decisions." "Who are you?" Elliot demanded, his voice shaking. "What's happening?" "What do you mean, I've made too many decisions?" The man stepped closer, and as he did, the surroundings around them started to shift again. A new world was being formed, and Elliot could feel it. His choices, his actions were pulling him through different realities, each more twisted than the last. "You've already created a dozen realities," the man continued, his tone flat, almost amused. "Each one more real than the last. You think you're controlling it, but you're not. You can't stop what you've set in motion." "What does that mean?" Elliot asked, his voice rising. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be God or whatever this is." "Does it matter?" the man said, his tone growing colder. "The world you've created is already unstable. You've broken something. A balance has been shattered." Elliot's mind raced as he tried to understand. Balance? Was he really the one breaking these worlds? Hadn't he just been playing a game? Hadn't it all just been supposed to be an escape? Now it felt like something far beyond that, something bigger, more dangerous. Now you must choose, the man said. Which reality will you save? Or will you let them all collapse? Elliot's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a game. These weren't just virtual realities, this was real. Every choice he made, every decision, had consequences. And now he had to decide, which world mattered enough to save. And which one was his true reality? His mind screamed for an answer, but no words came. There were too many choices. Too many possibilities. He'd made this mess, and now it was up to him to fix it, or let everything he'd built fall apart. Elliot stood there, frozen, staring at the figure in front of him. His mind was a blur of confusion, panic, and something else, something deeper. He wanted to yell, to demand more answers, but the words stuck in his throat. Every decision he'd made, every small choice in the game had led him to this moment. Now, he was caught between a dozen realities, each one a reflection of his desires, his fears, his failures. And the man, this shadowy figure, was offering him nothing but an ultimatum. Which reality will you save? The man asked again, his voice cold and impassive. Or will you let them all collapse? Elliot opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was dry, his thoughts tangled in a maze of impossible choices. He didn't know how to pick. The worlds were all so real now. The people in them, the places, the relationships, they felt as real as the world he'd come from. And yet, none of it was truly his. Every reality was a reflection of his decisions, yes, but they were not his to choose between. They were just possible. Just what-ifs made real. What happens if I choose none of them? Elliot finally managed, his voice shaky but defiant. What if I just let it all burn? The figure's head tilted slightly, as if considering the question. You can try, he said, his tone flat. But you'll never know if the destruction is the end or just the beginning of something worse. Elliot's heart raced, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The weight of the decision hung over him, suffocating him. He had thought he could control this. He thought the game would be a distraction, an escape. But now it was something far darker. The idea that these worlds might collapse under his watch, that his choices might unravel the very fabric of reality, it was too much to bear. How do I know which one is real? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How do I know which world is worth saving? You don't, the figure replied, stepping closer. Not until you make your choice. Not until you commit. Elliot clenched his fists, staring at the man. The world around him flickered again, a painful jolt of vertigo sweeping through him. He could feel it, the instability, the fracture in the multiverse. It was as if the walls between realities were crumbling, and the game, the worlds, the decisions, they were all fighting against each other, collapsing under the pressure of too many possibilities. Elliot's mind whirled. He thought of Lana, his girlfriend in one of the realities. The one who had trusted him, who believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. But he couldn't be sure if she was real. Was she just another version of her? Another what-if he had created? And then there was the other Lana, the one who didn't know him, who was angry and distant, who had left him in a different world. Which one was the real one? And did it matter, and what about the worlds themselves? One was a utopia, flawlessly designed, everyone living in harmony. Another was a dystopia, ravaged by war, where the streets ran red with blood. He had created them all. He had built these worlds, these alternate versions of himself, with every choice, every click, every decision. But now, they were on the brink of destruction. Elliot squeezed his eyes shut, trying to clear his thoughts, but the pressure of the decision weighed him down. His pulse was pounding in his ears, and his vision swam. I don't know what to do, he murmured, the words barely escaping his lips. I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted to play. The man before him regarded him silently for a moment, then stepped forward, reaching out. His hand brushed Elliot's arm lightly, and when their skin touched, it sent a shock through Elliot's entire body. It was like a jolt of electricity, sharp and painful. For a brief moment, his vision blacked out, and when it returned, everything was different. He was no longer in the shadowy void. He was standing in the middle of a familiar street, his street, the one from his apartment. But something was wrong. The world was tinted, like everything had been altered slightly. It was a small thing, an imperceptible shift, but it made the world feel wrong. As if the ground beneath him was shifting. The man was gone. But Elliot wasn't alone. He looked around, and there she was. Lana. She stood a few feet away, watching him with a mix of sadness and something else, something that looked almost like resignation. Lana? Elliot whispered, his voice hoarse, torn between relief and dread. Are you real? Lana didn't smile. Instead, she shook her head, her eyes filling with something darker than confusion, something like sorrow. You can't fix this, Elliot, she said softly. You can't just keep making decisions and expect everything to be fine. There are consequences to this. You're breaking everything. Elliot's chest tightened. What do you mean? What do you mean, breaking everything? Lana looked down, her hands clenched into fists. You've created too many realities, too many versions of us. Too many versions of you. You can't be everywhere. You can't fix it all. Sooner or later, one of these worlds is going to collapse, and you'll be the one who has to watch it happen. And then you'll have to choose, who do you save? Which one is worth it? Elliot stared at her, his throat tight, the words stuck behind the lump that had formed there. I don't know, he whispered. I don't know what to do. Then you'll lose everything, she said softly, her voice breaking. If you don't choose, you'll lose it all. And just as quickly as she had appeared, Lana was gone, fading into the shifting haze of the world around him. Elliot stood there, his heart racing, the weight of the decision crashing down on him. There was no more game. No more virtual world. No more choices. This was real. Or at least, it felt real. And in that moment, he realized something important. He hadn't been playing a game at all. The game had been playing him. He turned his gaze to the horizon, where the sky was darkening, where the edges of the world were beginning to fade. He could feel it, the worlds were breaking apart, slipping through his fingers like sand. He had no more time. The question was no longer which reality to save. It was whether he could save any of them at all. Elliot took a deep breath and, for the first time in what felt like forever, made a choice. The world around him shifted once more, but this time, he didn't resist. He let it happen. He let the game, the realities, the consequences, all of it unfold. And as the light around him began to fade, he closed his eyes. It was all coming to an end. But maybe that was okay, because in the end, the only real thing left to save was himself.